difficult to follow. I hope you hear me. Glad to be here. Glad to be with Alain. Of course, in this 20 minutes forum, it's just a little bit too little time to really develop a line of thought. All one can do is more just trace, define positions, oppositions, and so on. I would nonetheless like to begin with reference to what is going on recently in your territory, or just off your territory in Louisiana, because I think it concerns precisely in a way, very oblique way, what Alain was talking about, this gap, distance between the real and the symbolic. I was thinking about, do you know how Freud's Freudian dream of Irma's injection is structured? First, you have this look deep into Irma's throat, the primal horror, distorted flesh. Then you have this sudden passage from the real into the ridiculous impotence of the symbolic, the three doctors exchanging faked arguments. Isn't this going on now in the United States public discourse? The look into the Irma's throat would have been those camera shots that we get of the oil gushing out, and then the three doctors literally exist, you remember, in the congressional hearing, as the three representatives who were exactly in the same comical way putting the blame of each other. You know, BP representative or CEO even said, no, it's not me, it's the subcontractor. That Halliburton or whatever, I think it's the big Dick Cheney's company, said, no, we just made the plan, it's our own subcontractor who poured the concrete, who screwed it up. And finally, the last one returned the ball and said, no, but we were just following the plans we got from the other two, and so on. So it's clearly this same constellation, but things are more tragic here. Remember when, I think, unfortunately, even President Obama appeared a little bit of a clown here for me when he pathetically claimed, I will make on behalf of American people, whatever, BP, British Petroleum, pay every cent of the damage, and so on and so on. Sorry, this is ridiculous. If the spilling will go on the way it goes, even if so many environment ruined, lives ruined, etc., you simply cannot pay for it. It's ridiculous. It's a little bit, I exaggerate consciously, like to say Germany will pay every cent for the Holocaust and so on. I mean, when catastrophes are too big, it's meaningless to talk in these terms. So we have to rethink it. I remember, here I connected to impossibility of sexual relationship. I remember some 20 years ago, exactly in the same territory, the waters, sea waters south of Louisiana, Ted Kennedy, at that point senator, was caught by a paparazzo in a lone boat. He thought he is alone, only sea around, making love to a lady. I mean, it's a blurred image, but very clear. Her legs spread and so on. Exactly at that point, in the Senate, they were debating offshore drilling. And I laughed how a Republican senator, here I liked it, referring to this said, oh, I noticed that recently Senator Kennedy, who was opposed to it, changed his position on offshore drilling. Well, I'm here for Kennedy, no? I think that the only offshore drilling that should be allowed is the one that Kennedy was involved in, no? Okay, but not too much of this. Lacan and anti-philosophy. You know, I will just try to, again, state my case and not just mark some differences, allowing, hopefully, Alain to strike back. Because as I already developed once in Paris, I think, or London, our relationship is that of a master and the hysteric. He's the master, I'm the hysteric, provoking all the time and so on. It's sometimes difficult to provoke the master. Now, more seriously, I was deeply influenced by his insight into the whole concept of anti-philosophy. Maybe I would just shift a little bit or displace, expand, whatever, my understanding of it. Of course, I totally agree with Kim. We can say already Pascal and so on. But nonetheless, Pascal clearly situated himself outside philosophy. For me, maybe I'm wrong. Where do we have the first breakthrough of anti-philosophy as a philosophical position? Maybe, risky hypothesis, Kantian ethics. It's the first time that you clearly have this position of we have the domain of knowledge or theoretical truth, and then we have access to the real through the ethical act, which is, again, the relationship to the impossible real of thinking itself outside truth. It's also interesting how, speaking about anti-philosophy, did you notice that in the history of philosophy, from that point on, of Kantian revolution, practically, not totally, of course, entire philosophy no longer wants to be called philosophy. Kant, it's no longer metaphysics, but transcendental critique of the conditions of metaphysics. Fichte is Wissenschaftslehre. That is to say, teaching on science, not philosophy. Schelling privileges art. Hegel also said, no longer love of wisdom, but wisdom itself, not to mention Marx and so on and so on. So my first constatation when Lacan says, je m'insurge contre la philosophie is, well, welcome to the camp of philosophers. All philosophers from Kant onwards are doing nothing but that, insurging against philosophy. Nobody wants to be a philosopher. And
except me.
Ah, I agree with you. That's my point. Yeah, that's precisely my point. Because would you agree? Now I have a new proposal for you to try to convert you to my cause of the love of German idealism. You know your four domains, okay, conditions, whatever, of where a truth event can occur. Let's enumerate them. Science, politics, art, love. And I deeply agree with Adrian Johnston's reading of you, where he emphasized an aspect of this which is usually ignored, that this people usually just emphasize your opposite point, which is desuture, not totally attach philosophy to one truth condition. But I think, on the other hand, you make a much nicer point, which is even close to some kind of engaged Marxist thinking, which is nonetheless that philosophy cannot stand it on its own. Heroically, you have to attach yourself to a condition. You cannot be philosopher just in the air. And would you agree or not, this came to me, that the same goes for conditions of truth, goes for German idealism. Look, Kant's problem was science, was how to philosophize in the conditions of Newtonian science. Fichte is clearly politics, French Revolution. Schelling is art, and I claim Hegel is love. We have precisely the four guys there. But okay, now let me go on into anti-philosophy. Where do I maybe shift the accent a little bit? For me, I would say that the great breakthrough of anti-philosophy occurs with the so-called anti-Hegelian turn. In its three main forms. First, the late Schelling and the young Schopenhauer, then Kierkegaard, then Marx. I think that all three, in a way, meet your condition. Philosophy is, in all three versions, denounced as caught in its own circle of representation, abstract contextual thinking, and some kind of return to, not the real in the Lacanian sense, but some kind of a positive singular life foundation, which implies a critique of philosophy is enacted. For Kierkegaard, this is the unique existence of religious individual, which escapes philosophical conceptual mediation. For late Schelling, Heidegger is the primordial, irrational, pre-logical abyss of willing outside philosophical truth. And for Marx is the actual life process of actual people, and so on, and so on, and so on. So what I claim is that in all this here, things probably will become, I'm asking you a question, and not in this boring pseudo-pedagogical way where asking someone a question means that you already know what is the truth and just expect from you to confirm. It's really an open question. I claim that what unites all the three, and this is really what happened after Hegel, is that with all violence, a certain opposition became predominant, which I think maybe, I wonder if you would agree, defines the very coordinates for me of anti-philosophy. The opposition between productive presence and mere conceptual, idealistic theater scene of representation. Marx is here very brutal. Marx, the worst Marx, which I think should be abandoned. The Marx of German ideology, with all that stuff of philosophy is with regard to real life, like masturbation is with regard to sexual act, and so on. So again, this idea that we are caught into a closed circle of representation, philosophy, ideology is caught into it, and the point is to break out of this closed circle of representation into some more direct, productive presence. And as my colleague Alain developed in a very nice way, it's interesting how this same topic of denouncing representation became also actual throughout the 19th century. Of course, it was present before, but then it exploded as general problematizing of representation. For example, in the domain of love, all of a sudden the problem was, can love encounter be properly represented in the institution of marriage? With usual ambiguity. On the one hand, it was the bourgeois principle, you know, the only legitimate marriage is marriage which should be founded in love. But then you always have this idea, but nonetheless the institution of marriage cannot fully recuperate love. There is an excess. This idea of an excess escaping representation. You have the same in politics. You have parliamentary representation, but then, you know, this topic of can parliamentary representation adequately represent social base? Isn't there something in social base which escapes representation? The first one to fully develop this was already none other than Hegel in his wonderfully ambiguous notion of Pöbel, rebel. Rebel as the non-representable element. Now, here I'm just asking you a question and trying to draw maybe a line of distinction. I think this entire topic of productive presence and then misrepresented in some scene of representation should be ultimately dropped. This is for me the core of anti-philosophy. And now comes the evil part. I don't have time to develop it. The Stalinist part of me. I think you remain here, for my taste, sometimes a little bit of too much of anti-philosopher. Sometimes you also mobilize this representation versus the real of productive presence with this topic. So this is, again, my first point. And it would be very interesting here to play in a nice way different philosophers one against the other. For example, although we both totally more or less disagree with Derrida, I think that when Derrida, I wonder if you agree, is at his best, it's when he, not in his critique of metaphysics, we know that, but in his critique of too fast, direct, anti-philosophical attempts to break out. The Derrida I love is Derrida reading Foucault, Bataille, Levinas, where he takes someone who tries to enact the basic anti-philosophical gesture, like Bataille, against Hegelian philosophy, sovereignty. Foucault, against Cartesian cogito, madness, as anti-philosophy point outside, or Levinas, against philosophical totality, infinity of relating to otherness. And I think here Derrida is a good anti-philosopher. In a wonderful, detailed analysis, he shows how all these attempts to break out remain nonetheless in a hidden way determined by the field they want to undermine. So here, again, we can learn something. We can learn something from Derrida. You know, Derrida is not just the one who wants to screw philosophy, break out of it, and so on and so on. He is a good philosopher, especially good in showing how it's not as easy as it may appear to break out of philosophy. Especially actual today, I think, is, for example, Derrida's, and later developed by others, critique of Levinas. Because I think that if there is one of the great books of anti-philosophy, it's Levinas's Totality and Infinity. And I think it is easy to show how Levinas's critique of Hegel, and especially of Heidegger, which was later taken over by Jean-Luc Marion, this idea that even Heidegger remains too much within philosophy, that even the ontological difference between being and entities still remains within the horizon of being, while we must break through towards this infinite radical otherness of God beyond being. I think it can be shown in a convincing way, every serious philosopher can show it, that Levinas simply doesn't hold there. That the price is a very superficial reduction of the notion of being to some pretty naive, positive reality, and then you can say, oh, but God is outside it, and so on and so on. A Heideggerian who would have insisted here that even if God outside beyond being, still has to, of course, not exist as a determinate object, but has to be present, disclose itself in a certain way, would be fully justified. You cannot escape it as simple as that. So, again, I don't have time to develop it, but the reason I remain faithful to Hegel would have been that I insist that Hegel is absolutely unique here. He is on the, usually people perceive Hegel in this shift from traditional metaphysics philosophy to anti-philosophy in the guise of the 19th century historicism, life philosophy, and so on, as somewhere in between. As they say, on the one hand, Hegel remained absolute metaphysician, system, everything. On the other hand, we already find in Hegel good historical analysis, and so on and so on. I think this image of Hegel is deeply misleading, like a little bit here, a little bit there. I think he was not a little bit here, a little bit there. He was neither here nor there. He was a unique point, no longer philosopher in the sense of metaphysical philosopher, but not yet anti-philosopher. That's what makes Hegel so traumatic. So now let me go on into just two more points. First, I'll try to be as brief as possible, into how I locate Lacan's anti-philosophy. Basically, I am totally in full agreement with Alain. Maybe I would just formulate the ambiguity of Lacan in a little bit different way. For me, first one has to be precise in where does Lacan locate that anti-philosophical point, if you would have put it, on behalf of which Lacan makes this pathetic claim. Je m'insurge, I raise myself contre la philosophie, against philosophy. This point is clearly jouissance, the excess of enjoyment. For Lacan, this excess of, for Lacan, let me be very precise. Philosophy is that which begins with Parmenides, you know, the same is being and logos, thinking, talking, this kind of a pre-established harmony between discourse and being. Being can be logically apprehended, set. For Lacan, again, as you pointed out, this is the anti-philosophical core of Lacan. There is something which introduces a crack here. Here is a nice quote from Lacan of 1966, his seminar on the object of psychoanalysis. Quote, I challenge whichever philosopher to account now for the relation that is between the emergence of the signifier and the way jouissance relates to being. No philosophy, I say, meets us here today. The wretched, aborted freaks of philosophy, which we drag behind us from the beginning of the last, means 19th century, as the habits that are falling apart, are nothing but a way to frisk rather than to confront this question, which is the only question about truth and which is called and named by Freud the death drive, the primordial masochism of jouissance. All philosophical speech escapes and withdraws here. Now, I will try here to be at the same time critical but also positive towards Lacan. First, I would say what always fascinated me in Lacan is what did he, one enigma which an ex-colleague of Alain, François Balmes, in his very good studies on Lacan emphasized, the great mystery and perhaps the best way to approach Lacan is to ask a very simple, almost detective question. Lacan obviously knew Heidegger very well. Why then did he stick to the notion of the subject? Why didn't he drop subject? I mean, as the name for the core of, inhuman core of human being. I think the reason is, and here again, from a weird perspective, I approach one of the big topics of Alain, where I agree with him, the relationship between language and truth. Where I support Alain fully is in his, the way I understand it, anti-hermeneutic trust of not identifying truth with. The one who developed this most radically was Heidegger, arguably. This idea that truth is ultimately the historically destined horizon of being, which dwells, is inscribed into our language. And in this historicized transcendental mode, a Heideggerian would have said, this is the unsurpassable horizon of our access to truth. The ultimate, the furthest you can go is to reflect on the horizon of how things appear to you, of how being is disclosed. For example, you can make, I don't know how many speculative quantum physics discoveries, but in order to pursue them, you already have to have a certain historically destined, embodied in language, pre-understanding of being. So all we can do then is to think the event, not in Alain's sense, but as Heideggerian Ereignis of new destinies of being. This totally abyssal game of eventual occurrences of modes of disclosure is the ultimate horizon. So in this sense, for Heidegger, language is the house of being. What Lacan does here, basically, I think, is just to add something, a dimension missing in what Lacan does here, missing in Heidegger. To put it in cynical terms, for Lacan, language is not just the house of being, it's a torture house of being. We are basically tortured by language. That's all the topic of castration, distortion, and so on. We are never at home in the house of being. It's a traumatic discord. And again, the name of this discord is jouissance. And so here I come to Alain. I don't like Elfriede Jelinek. Her style is too dirty for me. But she said something that I deeply agree with, a wonderful phrase. She said, language should be tortured to tell the truth. I think that this would be the second counterpart, that we should drop all this hermeneutic trust into, you know, the access to truth is open yourself to the message which is in language. No, we should torture language. And I think maybe we should even read poetry and art in this way, as different modes of torture. What is poetry? It's a great torture of language. Imagine how you have to torture language to write a simple sonnet form. Cut words, squeeze them, and so on. Even in cinema as art, what was Eisenstein doing? My God, all his works are already works of extreme violence and torture. Cut, montage, stitch it together, and so on. Now you will say, yeah, this is Eisenstein's manipulative approach. What about the great opposition to Eisenstein? André Bazin, Rossellini, Arthur Tarkovsky, where you have the passive attitude of just filming, not intervening. Well, I would say it's a different mode of torture. It's slow it down. How do you call that instrument where somebody is tortured so that you tie him up and then stretch it? Yeah, that's Tarkovsky. So I would say, imagine a debate between Eisenstein and Tarkovsky. It's like two torturers. What's the better way to squeeze out the truth? And I agree with Alain. I think that of course, we think in language, but nonetheless, paradoxically, language is not our horizon. Language in its, let's call it naively, mytho-poetic function. Language, as you know, poetry in the bad sense of poetry as founding a nation and so on. I think that we can do more. Truly great artists, poets do more. They torture their language. They force it to go beyond. We can, within language, think with language, against language, to arrive at a true universality. This is a very radical thesis, but I think it's crucial. And I'm not sure Lacan himself is clear here. If he were to be clear at this point, he is ambiguous, he would no longer be anti-philosopher. But I think this is the crucial point. Again, is the historicist transcendental attitude, language is our fate, the last thing we do, is this the last thing, or can we and break out of the, to use Frederick Glemson's term, the prison house of language and formulate universality outside it? Now, a step further. I claim that this is why, as Balmes demonstrates, Lacan stick to the notion of subject. Subject for Lacan, as you pointed out when you emphasize this weakness and so on, subject for Lacan is not in this modern way the excess of this Cartesian subject, not in Descartes' sense, but more in this Heideggerian sense of modern subjectivity, dominate the world, mediate it, technologically master it, and so on. Subject is the one who, as Lacan puts it, who suffers from the symbolic. It's tortured. And to designate this, Lacan, this dimension of being tortured by language is missing in Heidegger, which is why I'm so sad I don't have time to develop this, why I think Lacan emphasizes a feature of Antigone, which is totally absent in Heidegger. In his two great readings of Antigone, Heidegger never mentions this famous position in between the two deaths. That is to say, you are still biologically alive, exclude from, because this is the pure position of what Agamben later calls homo sacer, of subject as tortured. And I'm even tempted to say, to make a quick, far-fetched reference to fashionable one, fashionable in accusations against Heidegger, to concentration camps and so on. You know where you can see that Heidegger misses this dimension? You know that famous passage from Heidegger, which horrified many people, where he says that in concentration camps, they were just in an industrial way producing corpses. People were not really dying there. Well, of course, this is true in a way, but I would say it is true for the executioners. If you were somebody dying in Auschwitz, you didn't feel, oh my God, I'm just an object being technologically produced, no? Precisely this other side is missing here. Now we can go on. Because of all this, of this dimension missing, I agree with what you developed as Lacan, from truth to knowledge about truth to knowledge. I would only say that maybe desperately there is an alternate way to read this as not anti-philosophical. In what sense? You know that strictly parallel to the movement that you described in these precise terms is, and this is very nicely, incidentally, I love this naivety of Balmes, who makes a brutal clinical judgment on Heidegger. I love it. It appears brutal nonsense, but where he says that the problem with Heidegger's description of, for example, Dasein being there in Sein und Zeit is that it's good for neurotics, but it doesn't cover psychotics. You know in what naive sense he was right? Let's take what Catherine Malabou calls post-traumatic subject, or this, homo sacer and so on. They describe a subjective position of this suffering, being tortured by language and so on, which I think, you know how Heidegger describes being human in time and being, as this from future through the past to present, engaged existence and so on. You are out of that. You are no longer caught into this structure of care, engaged existence, but nonetheless you are not outside animal. You are still human, being deprived of it. This would be vaguely the psychotic position. For this, there is no place in Heidegger. So I find this a very nice thesis of how, again, Lacan sticks to the notion of subject, not because he remains modern age, faithful to modern age subjectivity, which is the cause of our crisis. He does, but for the opposite reason. And now I want just to supplement you. Balmes shows in a triumphant way here how this movement from truth, knowledge of truth, knowledge is strictly correlative in Lacan to the forceful reaffirmation of the Cartesian cogito. When you have this late Lacan's knowledge, always you should think cogito. Here, you should always bear in mind that when we think about Lacan et cogito, it's not enough to recite those boring old poems, you know, of yeah, Lacan said against Descartes, I am not where I think. This can still be read in a purely anti-philosophical way. It simply means the truth of my being, the true lively productivity is not where I think. Then Lacan turns it around and says, I think where I am not. This is more interesting, where the unconscious is not the fullness of my being outside my thought, but it's a pure thinking outside myself, not where I feel myself existentially as the one I am. Then there are other formulations, but as Balmes points out very nicely, what Lacan does in his seminar, I think on logique du fantasme, logic of fantasy, is to return to the identity of cogito and being, but as an empty set. For the last Lacan, cogito, in cogito, being and thinking do coincide, but in a negative way. In cogito, I'm pure thinking, but which is just a form of thinking, without any content. At the same time, I'm pure being, but deprived of any content. It's just as if the two empty points overlap here. And again, as such, this cogito should be asserted as universal, non-historical. Non-historical. Historicity is, I think, not the ultimate horizon. Which is why, as I try to develop in one of my texts, I think that one can, in a very nice way, refer here to Walter Benjamin. You know, when he talks about these two types of violence, staatsbildend and staatszerstörend. Violence which creates state, and violence which, this divine violence. And I think that Heidegger's problem is that when he does talk about violence and language, his notion of language as poets who grounds a polis, a nation, is still staatsbildend. I would like, in parallel to the relation of violence and state, to assert also not violence immanent in this imposing a certain disclosure of being, what poets do for a nation, but sprachzerstörend violence. Violence of torturing language breaking through to universality. So here, I think that maybe partially things, I haven't yet thought them to the end. Things are here very ambiguous for me, but I would have said nonetheless that here maybe Lacan's anti-philosophy can nonetheless be maybe reinterpreted as precisely, because you know when Lacan says anti-philosophy, one should always ask the obvious question, what is philosophy for him? And the quote that I read you is very ambiguous here. Lacan qualifies philosophy, to which he opposes, as wretched aborted freaks of philosophy, which we drag behind us from the beginning of the 19th century. That is to say, basically anti-philosophy. He designated philosophy this post-Hegelian philosophy. So again, what I would have said is that one should never forget that for Lacan, philosophy is rather this hermeneutic harmony between being and thinking, which is historically specified and so on and so on. I think that through the link of cogito and knowledge and so on, one can maybe construct an out-reading Lacan against Lacan of totally crazy, like we want to do, a kind of a return to pure cogito, matem, knowledge, and so on, outside this historicist hermeneutic, universal. But one crucial problem here. What about jouissance as nameless and so on? Doesn't Lacan nonetheless sustain his critique of philosophy in this disturbing element of excess of jouissance? Many things can be said here. I think one can even answer here in a very nice way Quentin Meillassoux, when he insisted on the problem of fossil as that third element which breaks this transcendental correlation. I think that for Lacan, you don't have to go outside. The true fossil is object small a. It's here in me, not Lacan. For Lacan, Meillassoux would have been way too Leninist in the bad sense of materialism and empiriocriticism. Meillassoux, for me, remains all too stuck in this typical naive pre-Hegelian problematic of we are caught in our representations. Can we reach out of them to reality in itself or not? For me as a Hegelian, this is a pseudo problem. The problem is not can we reach the in itself. The problem is Badiou's problem. How can in this stupid real something like thought emerge? The true problem is not can we go beyond our appearances to the real in itself. The problem is the one approached by Badiou in his Logics of the World. How can in the flat stupidity of the real something like the word emerge? Hegel knew this very clearly. The problem is not break out of appearance. The problem is how is appearance possible? Okay, but to go on. So, jouissance. Here, I wonder if you would accept something. In one of your texts, you were totally right to characterize Lacan's reference to jouissance féminine as a reference to some kind of a cultural unsayable. But I don't think it is necessary to read it in that way, although I admit this is a predominant way. You know, in Lacan's formula of sexuation, when Lacan, how does Lacan describe this feminine position of jouissance? Usually this is read as something in woman resist symbolic order. Not all of woman is caught into the symbolic order. But I think if we read this in the sense of there is something in woman, this excess of mystical, enraptured jouissance which resists the symbolic, maybe we don't read Lacan correctly. Maybe we should nonetheless emphasize how the non-all of feminine jouissance also means that there is no exception. We should also say there is nothing in woman which is outside the symbolic order or whatever. So I think that instead of reading jouissance féminine as kind of a mystical enrapture and so on, we should, so that to put it bluntly in an almost sexist way, we men are purely within the symbolic order, women are with one leg in, with another part of them it resists with some kind of literature. I think women are paradoxically more fully in the symbolic order. This is why they are non-all. They don't have any... Oh, in this sense, I think that here is how I would try to save Lacanian jouissance and the real for philosophy. And you already indicate that path. I think that what I don't like is this anti-philosophical notion of jouissance as some terrifying excess, too strong for symbolization. But I am tempted to read Lacan's famous formula, which you also quote on, that the real is only accessible through the deadlock, l'impasse of the symbolization, in a very strong literal way. The real is not some in itself, and Lacan formally opposes the idea that the real is any kind of Kantian in itself, which then we can only partially grab. No, I think that the real literally is nothing but the deadlock of symbolization. A totally immanent real, a real which is just, yes, I stop, cuts of symbolization, and so on and so on. So from here, I would just like to mark maybe one or two, this is a question to you, how you would react differences. One big difference, I'm even not sure about it myself, we have this debate for 15 years, I think, is that in your logics of the worlds, I will just state the position. You seem to imply that what you call world, I think, I know I violently disagree with you and you with me here. I think there is no world without language, to cut a long story short. And I think that the very categories you use, like the crucial category of the point is a signifying category. I agree with you, with language is not, here I'm also a Platonist, not a limit. But I claim that, again, the category of world is thinkable only within the human universe of language. While you, if I got you correctly, for you, there are worlds already in, to put it in very naive terms, in reality outside man. Once you even spoke of, ironically, I know, of your dialectic of nature. Second point, you are usually reproached with a very stupid criticism that you are secretly an idealist in the sense of human animal, but then out of nowhere, event, grace, blah, blah. And then the idea is we should nonetheless develop out of concrete history how the event can emerge. I'm tempted to say the opposite, that my critique, open question to you, would have been the opposite one. What I problematize is not event, but human animal. I don't think there is something like human animal. I think that, of course there is empirically, but okay, to cut a long story short, I just will, and then I will finish, designate my position now. I claim that what you call animal life, this pursuit of servicing the good, service the bien, and so on, this normal animal utilitarian existence, and the truth event, that this polarity, duality, doesn't cover the entire field. There is something which I am tempted to call, with terms like anxiety, death drive, and so on, which is neither the one nor the other. And I think that with humans, what you call animal life, this ordinary existence, utilitarian and so on, servicing the goods, always comes secondary in the sense of its attempt to stabilize some traumatic anxiety, which is also a condition for truth event. You need anxiety, displacement, and so on in order to open up the space for the truth. And I think, that's my final point, that this maybe can be read in a not anti-philosophical way. My whole wager is that all this topic of death drive and so on should be totally de-imaginarized. It's what was called in philosophy, in German idealism, self-relating negativity, and so on. So again, I totally accept your tension between truth, the domain of truth procedures, and human-animal. I just think that we need a third domain, death drive, anxiety, and so on, which then allows us to properly locate these two. But I know I didn't prove anything here. But you see my desperate wager, totally agreeing with your anti-philosophy. What I'm trying to do is consciously reading Lacan against himself, because let's be clear, what Jacques-Alain Miller is doing now with his right liberal description of Lacan as some kind of a liberal wise man and so on, this is the danger of this, what you said, dismissing the truth. That then you definitely, okay, just to finish, because the first thing one should say is that where I disagree with Miller, I hope we agree, is this idea of looking in the last Lacan for some point of last wisdom, you know, like just before he died, he saw something. Which is why, maybe you know it better than me, Lacan's last official mistress, Catherine Millot, I think, yeah, was the object of such affection. The idea was that she was there when Lacan was dying, and that just on the point of dying, he told her something, you know. This last, as you would say, singularity encounter of the real. No, I claim, agreeing with you, that I claim that somewhere between, in those 10 years or more seminars of from anxiety to maybe encore, this was Lacan at his top. And I think, frankly, all those attempts with notes the last years, sorry to tell you, I'm more and more convinced they're gradual disintegration. I don't think, and you effectively have what you said, all this, you know, accommodate to the symptom, truth doesn't matter, a kind of almost, Miller is right, Rortian playfulness, which to us as old, I wouldn't say old followers of the follower of Lenin, not to name the name, no, this I don't buy. So I'm sorry if I was too long, but you see my point. What I'm trying to do is desperately to nonetheless save Lacan in some sense for philosophy. I'm very sorry if I was too long, and please strike back with all your force. Thank you.